several other writers.
I'm not at all surprised. I mean, and I can understand, I certainly sympathize with what you said about style, and the character, you couldn't like suddenly move him to a whole different era. But what I was thinking is that you would really have to plot the book within sort of the confines of the baggage or whatever had been done before. You couldn't suddenly award him a different wife or set of children or different parents.
You had to keep it in what they called the canon.
Right.
What is actually known about the character's life at what period. And Howard himself was pretty sloppy about this because he wasn't thinking of writing. He was writing for the pulps. He wasn't writing a real history that was going to be checked against reality. Actually, the most difficult thing I had was novel length, because the character and his situations were perfect for short stories. It was a bit harder to stretch them out to novel length, and I'd turn in a manuscript and I'd keep getting called back by Jim Rigney, who was my editor at the time, better known as Robert Jordan. And
is that who he is?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Jim and his wife Harriet McDougall were my editors on that series. Jim died a couple of years ago, but they were always calling back and said, "No, you need more material here. This is too short. It reads fine. It's tight. Plot's good. Everything, action, fine. We need about 20,000 more words." So they'd keep sending it back to me, and then once again, here I felt like I was just padding it out and adding stuff that didn't add to the story, but they wanted a specific length. So
when you did that, what would you add? Would you change the plot, or would you simply fill in sidebar kind of stuff?
Episodes, essentially. That was about the only way that I could do it. Between this episode and this episode, I'd put in another episode, and to lengthen it out, something that wouldn't interfere too much with the rhythm of the story itself. But I was writing them at about 75 to 90,000 word novels, and I think they would have been better if they'd let me stick to like about 60 to 65,000, but that wasn't my choice.
You're talking about narrative drive, in other words, the way the plot unfolds. I remember years ago, do you remember when Smilla's Sense of Snow was published by Peter Hogue? A lot of people had a desperate time reading it because the story itself is not necessarily linear. And there was a great statement made to me by a Canadian bookseller I'm very fond of, and he said, Barbara, the whole point of Smilla is the digressions. It's not the plot. It's all the sidebar stuff. And so I've often wondered, how an author, particularly in a situation like yours where you're trying to move it up, how tempting is the total digression, or is versus keeping your plot moving steadily forward with more episodes?
Well, it's something like the Conan stories. There's very little room for digression, really, because they're geared toward action and color and narrative. There's not a whole lot of digression to be done.
Okay.
If you want a book like, say, Moby Dick, which is practically one long digression, they go from digression to digression to digression, and then every once in a while get back to the ship and looking for the whale.
But that was such a slim plot line. You really had to have digression, right?
Right, and it's, of course, it gives the reader a lot of stuff to skip over. Here comes another digression about the color of the whale or whatever, and then so you just go on to the next scene that actually takes place on the Pequod.
Well, I think that people who read crime fiction are plot-driven more than they are digression-driven, and there's a lot of hybrids and stuff going on at the moment. I've heard many readers say today literary fiction is distinguished by books in which nothing really happens, but everybody says it elegantly, as opposed to crime fiction, which may be cruder in not as graceful in its prose and whatever, but which you do have, in fact, narrative drive.
Well, modern crime fiction, of course, is pretty much the invention of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and a few other writers.
American, anyway.
American
certainly
crime
is,
fiction,
yeah.
right? And as opposed to, say, the Agatha Christie type story. Essentially, it was all invented by Poe. Back to America again. The tales of ratiocination, if that's how you're supposed to pronounce that, I'm not really sure.
Is it ratio or ratio? I've never known.
I've heard ratiocination. I have no idea. I think he just invented the word anyway. Who knows how he pronounced it. But in any case, the story, the detective story, what we think of as the detective story, things like Murders in the Rue Morgue and the Purloined Letter and things like that, and other writers picked up on that and it became a very popular genre. But then it got kind of rarefied and people like Dashiell Hammett, who'd been a real detective, decided to write real crime novels about real criminals.
Right. Yeah, he was actually a private eye himself.
Yeah, he'd worked for the Pinkertons for a number of years, and Raymond Chandler picked up on that, and then Mickey Spillane, really defined hard-boiled. For a while. All these were fairly short novels. You notice, no great big sprawling novels, because crime fiction fits that mold extremely well. Not a whole. You've got a particular problem to solve, and it can be solved with or without varying amounts of violence happening, and so forth. And eventually you come to a conclusion, and you don't have to have a big, long. Now a lot of modern mysteries are very large, but that's a change of taste rather than
it tends to be
necessity.
Thrillers more than detective stories. I think private eye novels and detective stories still stay relatively lean. The thrillers where you have the giant chase and you've got all the time. I think James Rollins does a very good job with thrillers, but there's just a staggering amount of subplot and information and scientific stuff that goes on, and there can be weaponry and whatever it is. Well,
I think a lot of that started in the 80s with James Ellroy and the Black Dahlia, and his L.A. quartet. Very large, substantial novels, but there are huge, sprawling things with lots of subplots and lots of detail about Los Angeles in that period, which is just fun to read about. Even if it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the story, and the various personalities of the era and everything. One problem that it has is, well, for instance, the Black Dahlia, about 3/4 of the way through, has a false climax, where they think they've got the killer and all this stuff, and it's all been solved. But you're sitting with that great big book, and you see that there's all these pages still to go. So that can't be. So
it does sort of spoil the idea, doesn't it?
It's easier if you're doing it in a magazine, because you don't know where in the magazine that particular story ends. So it's easier to catch your readers with a false climax there.
Do you think that electronic publishing is going to revive to some degree the idea of serial publication? I know that there are some authors who are now in print who maybe started out by publishing electronically and done it serially, or they will put up a certain amount on a website and everybody reads it and goes, what next? It's a way of doing that old pulp thing in a different format.
Yeah, I know. I've seen several promising venues. Subterranean Press does things like that, but they also produce print books, but they do some serial online stuff. I'm kind of waiting to see somebody come up with a really practical way of doing it. It's been tried. Stephen King tried it for a while, and that apparently didn't work out very well. Other people have tried it with varying degrees of success, and I'm just, before getting into anything like that, of course, I don't even know whether I'm really suited for that kind of writing. I haven't tried it before.
Well, you might be, since you are longer on brevity, if I can sort of make that poor statement. But what I think will help is the development of things like the Kindle and the Sony e-reader and all. If people are going to read on handheld devices, I think that may help popularize that. I mean, it's like the pulps really fit magazines. And now that most stories are delivered in books, pulp fiction doesn't work as well. But the new technology, the whole e-platform thing may, make a difference that way. There's
also retro publishing, like Hard Case Crime.
Isn't that fun? There is a great company.
I'm working on a book that I think would be perfect for Hard Case, and I'm doing it just so I can get one of those covers.
Aren't they fabulous?
Those are fabulous, covers that remind me of all the old gold medal originals that I grew up on.
Well, they're very much, I think, they're modern, and yet they're a real tribute. For anybody who wants to see them, the actual website for that is hardcasecrime.com. One of the things I love the most about it is I never knew that Larry Block wrote umpteen 100 books as a pulp writer under all these different names, some of them as a woman, some of them erotic fictions. I mean, it's like a whole sub-life for Larry that has been revealed here by Hard Case Crime.